This podcast, Strange, Rare, and Peculiar, is for kind of those in the know about homeopathy, deepening your knowledge, bringing you more information about what you need to know and maybe what you can leave aside about homeopathy.
Homeo what?
Homeo what?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hello to you.
Hello, hello. Here we are again.
I know, this is exciting.
I love this, except we're in a different spot.
We are in a different spot.
We switched chairs.
Yeah, I feel it's kind of like trying to sleep on the other side of the bed. I'm not sure if...
Not sure how you feel about this, right?
Yeah.
I actually prefer this.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
You can fit in that chair a little bit better.
I love this chair.
Anyway, we're here to talk about a topic that...
Oh, it's fraught?
Wow.
It's fraught?
I would say it's exciting. Well, it's fraught from some perspectives. The topic is potency.
Yeah.
And, and I guess, gosh, there are just so many things to discuss. Can we start with sort of the earliest issue?
The earliest challenge that came up in homeopathy with regards to potency.
Or our understanding of it is that potency didn't come first.
Potency, here's a factoid for you. In 1834... Hahnemann is 79 years. Oh no.
1755 to 18. What's the number you're looking at?
1834. Yeah, so he's 79 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Is the first year he only gave remedies in potency.
Mm-hmm. So let's just explain that, right?
How about that?
Because what happened was, and I think this kind of knocks people's socks off the first time they realize this. So when Hahnemann made his initial discovery, we all know about translating Cullen's Materia Medica, comes across the toxicology of cinchona, and the rest is history, provings and so forth. But
You say cinchona.
you say cinchona?
I do say cinchona.
Do you say chincona?
No, I say no, I'm more confused. No, I say cinchona. Anyone out there, any geeks out there that would like to weigh in on correct pronunciation of the word that we're looking for, China,
What's it called? What is the
Peruvian
colloquial bark. Or the bark?
The bark.
It was the
Jesuits' bark.
The Jesuits' bark. It was so ubiquitously used that it was referred to solely as the bark.
The bark.
Bark.
Anyway,
so this sort of sets off homeopathy. So what that tells us is that the first principle of homeopathy is just similars, not just similars, but it's the philosophical concept.
Are you kidding?
Of
it's
like
the only
cures
thing.
like.
It is that which defines what it is that homeopaths do. Homeo.
Exactly.
Pathos. It's all about similars.
It's all about similars, which is so interesting because the controversy about homeopathy
it's nothing to do with similars.
Exactly.
There is no controversy about similars.
Because it can be proven as a fact. I mean, Hahnemann does...
Well, it's every day. It's just everyday common sense.
Yeah. But there's so many great... this came up in a class the other day. Somebody was talking about ways... It was someone in part-time year one asked whether or not we had any examples of how to prove the idea of similarity. And I said, this is where Hahnemann totally nails it in the Organon. But let's talk about that at a different time since I don't want to get too sidetracked from potency. But
yeah.
I do think it's interesting that Hahnemann started out giving medicines as tinctures. So it was the same medicine that was used in that time.
But using it according to similars.
And therefore understanding the substances in a slightly different way.
Correct.
And moving away from the named conditions to just understand what the idea of similarity was. I mean, I just think that's a game changer because it takes this idea of potency out of the equation, which, when we talk about research and where we believe the long game is in research in homeopathy, we believe, we talk about this a lot, that we should move away from simply trying to prove the mechanism of action. In other words, how does it work?
Of the infinitesimal dose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When in reality, that's secondary to the conversation, which is about similars.
Well, hang on. Would you therefore be comfortable prescribing only potencies 12C and below? Because that immediately takes away all the controversy.
Not all.
Because you're at least having the same conversation as people taking microdoses of psilocybin.
That's a good point, to put it in the same context as microdoses. Yeah, I mean...
an infinitesimal dose is crazy town, but a microdose, there's truckloads of science behind the stimulating effect of a microdose.
Yeah. Well, and we should be clear for those who might be just, kind of joining into the conversations about homeopathy. So what we're talking about here is, the preparation of a homeopathic remedy. It defies contemporary scientific, well, not totally, but in many ways defies sort of what would be considered Newtonian scientific explanations.
Correct, yeah.
Which, of course, irritates me because Newton, wrote more on alchemy than anything else.
Definitely a different conversation.
It's a totally different conversation. But the one that we're having about potency is one that says, okay, so there's a way in which homeopathic remedies are prepared and delivered that by way of of a very exacting process of trituration, dilution, and succussion renders them more potent the more times you go through this serial dilution process, which, again, runs contrary to the way that we imagine things in today's terms. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter in terms of the global argument, because that's not the sort of foundational principle.
I agree. I mean, let's tie this one up. What we're both totally agreeing on is that the thing that is first in homeopathy is similars. There's no controversy about that. The second point, I think, which was a really interesting one, is that what about it, folks? What about we don't prescribe 30C? What about we don't prescribe 200C or any other infinitesimal dose, any outrageous infinitesimal dose?
I'm just going to stop that one right now.
What do you mean you're going to stop me?
Because if you follow Hahnemann through to the 6th edition of the Organon and his prescribing in his later years in Paris, you see that Hahnemann's goal, one of his goals. Well, you're laughing at me.
Well, I'm laughing because I was just I solved the problem, and then isn't it a ridiculous solution to the problem?
Yeah, because what Hahnemann discovered was that, well, let me go back. What he was working toward was minimizing aggravation. In other words, whenever you're talking about any pharmaceutical process, whether it be, a homeopathic preparation of a drug, or whether it be a microdose, or whether it be a conventional preparation, there's a line between cure and harm. There's a line between cure and poison. I mean, you look at some of the substances that, that remain in use today, many of which are really poisonous, depending on the dose. So you could go to Hahnemann's time and say mercury in the calomel preparation, or arsenic. They were used because they worked. The problem is that there were deleterious, side effects and after effects. But at the end of the day, that's what happens now. I mean, chemotherapy,
totally.
is, just to name one class of
So the secondary feature of homeopathy, the principle of the infinitesimal dose, or at least using a systematic pharmaceutical method to render a substance safer and more gentle, was... Do we? I don't have a date about when he started playing around with that, but I know that 1834 end date, but not the beginning date. So your point is that, similars was applied using crude substances, what I would call crude substances,
that's right,
with extraordinary effect, and homeopathy spread far and wide on that basis, and probably that basis alone.
And I think when a lot of homeopaths hear that, it's like a kind of a wake up, like, wait, you're kidding me. Because so much emphasis is on the.
Yeah, let's do it by the ages. I mean, if Hahnemann is 45 when is 35 when he is messing around with cinchona, or Peruvian bark, or the bark.
Or cinchona.
1796 is when he first describes the principle of similars. And 1805, I think, 4 or 5 or 6, I can't remember, is the first time he talks about the word homeopathy.
Is that in Asclepius in the Balance?
It is. Yeah, exactly. And so either way, whenever you think historically that homeopathy began, 1790, 1796, or 1805, potency is not a part of it.
Yeah.
All right? So 1805, that's interesting. Then 5 years later, he's written the Organon. And clearly, I mean, we could probably get some expert advice on when he really did start to play around with potency, right? But it's somewhere in there. What are you laughing at me for? Because
that's what a lot of my research has been about. I mean, but I would have to find some of those dates where I'm laughing, like, we could find somebody to ask. Like,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just more about the
No,
dates.
I know. It's, but, yeah, thank you for the acknowledgement. I really appreciate it. I'll be leaving now.
That's funny. So, but back to potency. At some point, Hahnemann is then prescribing 1s and 2s. If you look at his case books, there's a really famous brony, a case of the washerwoman, and he gave I think it's the quote is something, gave to her according to the principle of similars 1 full drop of the bryonia root, dynamized to the 1st degree. And it's like, clearly, it's a 1C or it's a 1X or 1 something.
Well, and remember at that time, he also was not clear whether or not all substances should be potentized or dynamized.
Totally.
Well, that was pre-use of the term dynamization, but there was actually an extended period of time where Hahnemann was trying to sort out whether or not all remedies should have the same pharmaceutical preparation.
Well, I mean, isn't that, can we just jump to today?
Yeah.
Because isn't that, what the HPUS is doing, trying to identify the toxic, where does a substance become toxic?
Yeah.
And it's not the same.
Right.
It's
that's
really
so interesting. Yeah. It makes total sense, right? It would be like relative toxicity So as we look at this idea of potency, now we're kind of talking about it in historical terms, but because we'd be here all day if we just kept talking about all of that. But I think it'd be interesting to talk about it in today's terms as well, because, when in teaching homeopathy, and we've taught so many classes, so many people over the years, and the thing that gets a homeopath really kind of bungled up in their mind is, well, how do I give the remedy? Potency in posology is a really challenging aspect because it's not clear, and there are no like hard and fast rules. It's it requires a lot of sort of observation and interpretation.
If we take the administration of the remedy out of the equation for today and just talk about potency and the choice of potency.
Okay.
How about that? Because I think those are two separate conversations, really, aren't they?
I mean, they are, but they overlap a little.
Right.
Can we just make it a fuzzy border?
All right, a fuzzy border. So do you think that there is, in the literature at all, or any sort of precedent for an automatic potency selection in a situation?
I would say no, except that I think all the students in our clinical training program would say, well,
what we do. Well, that's very different, isn't it? Because that's based on, experience and experiment, which is what Hahnemann told us to do.
Yeah.
That's kind of the end. I reckon that should be our final point. But I mean, when I think about my training, I was, when I went to student clinic and I saw Misha, doing his thing, then he would be prescribing a 200 or a 1M, maybe
Single
once
dose.
or twice.
Yeah, exactly.
Single
split dose or collective split dose.
Yeah. And that would be for pretty much chronic cases, which was all we ever tended to see at the School of Homeopathy. So, that was what I did when I began my practice 1,000 years ago. And so, what it took was being sat down, actually just bringing up their name again. Ken Duran probably just gave me a bit of a schooling at some point and said, why are you prescribing tablets? Mm-hmm. So you're right about the interface between the administration and the potency question. And it was because then I said, because. Right.
Because that's what I was told to do.
And then I realized that, what I'd been taught was first, second, third, and fourth edition homeopathy.
Yeah.
Now, the fourth edition of the organon, I'm always confused. Which was chronic diseases? Was it
1828?
Okay, so the fourth edition of the organon is 1829. Mm-hmm. All right?
Right. So it was, that was part of its leap. But what was interesting is that, in my research, in my attempt to understand sort of Hahnemann's development of the system of potency, and it was a very non-linear way, right? And so, I've been trying to make the connections between which branches of sort of the history of chemistry, science and alchemy, and pharmacology informed, Hahnemann's decision. So the fourth edition of the organon it's very much about the carrier, isn't it? It's, the pellet or the tablet is important.
Good. Although, can I just say one clarifying thing. Hahnemann would never have been using anything close to a 200 or a 1M.
No.
He used two 200s at the end of his life.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. David Little seems to have illuminated that. So a high potency might have been 15C.
Yeah.
Or, quite possibly 30 in 1829. But yeah, back
Yeah,
to
so in the fourth edition of the Organon, that was really important. Now, what, that story of how Hahnemann developed potency, this is my favorite myth to bust.
What do you mean a myth? It's totally true. So Hahnemann's, it's a Thursday, and Hahnemann gets a text in his mobile phone. Come and see me. It's urgent. I need to see you at my house on on Strasse de von
Right.
Hohenheim. And off he goes, and his remedies are bouncing up and down in the saddlebags. And he realizes that the results, or he postulates and then realizes quite clearly, it's so scientific,
Sure.
that the reason his house call remedies are more potent are because of the bouncing up and down in the saddlebags.
Like as if that is, a succussion process. But I've heard the story. I mean, the story is it can be so fantastical. I've actually heard somebody say that, and what he realized was that the patients on the end of his route, as if he was going door to door, their potencies were so high.
Oh my God, they were doing so much better.
They were, or getting aggravations,
Wow.
whatever the case may be. Anyway, the idea that Hahnemann discovered potency by horse and buggy is just... It's ridiculous. I mean, he was a scientist. He was an empiricist.
Well, it defies everything that and now this is where credit is due.
Thanks a lot, yeah.
Because
aphorism 270, instead of having, the very exacting instructions for the manufacturing of the medicine, would be, drive 12 blocks with, a horse and buggy.
Yeah, but it's got to be a seven-hand horse.
Right, exactly.
But the exact. Have you read? Have you read? Has anyone read Aphorism 270 with the footnotes? There in black and white are the exact instructions on how to manufacture a remedy, and the logic and the numbers is nothing to do with a horse and a buggy.
No, it's unfathomable. But
it's ridiculous.
Okay, so he goes from, now that we've cleared that up, but but where that might have come in, but I bring up that story for, to sort of stretch the boundaries of how far, our logic can go. But there actually is an element of truth to it. And I want to say that this is somewhere in Lesser Writings, and I can't remember which essay, but what Hahnemann says is that in the fifth edition of the Organon, when Hahnemann changed the delivery method, so by the fifth edition, his Hahnemann is really working through the application of his chronic disease theory, and is convinced at that point that you don't just give a dose and wait. So fourth edition, give a dose and wait, give a dry dose, give a pellet dose and wait. And whether it's one dose, whether it's, a split dose, a collective split dose, however you do it, that's a fourth edition application of principles. You come to the fifth edition in Hahnemann, and this, of course, is, from the research I've done, finding the places where he would have gotten this information, right? So I'm not going to sidetrack down that alley for today, but there was a chemist that Hahnemann had, whose work Hahnemann had read, and he talks about water as the universal carrier for medicines, in particular the elixir of life. The way in which healing substances are delivered is in a water substance. And so then Hahnemann was then diluting the remedy, so no longer delivering them on a pellet. But
it's only 4 years after he wrote, black and white, the pill, take it in a pill, the pill is the thing. So, and I'm really interested in what you're saying, and I know you don't want to go down that route, but you're saying that between the years of 1829 and 1833, Hahnemann read or applied previous readings that he... So
my research suggests that sometime before 1816, so Hahnemann he started working on chronic diseases, 1816, and the first set, it was done in sort of like booklet form, and then in one, it was, I forget now what's the word I'm looking for. Oh, it'll come to me anyway. But so the first edition was published in 1828. Okay, so I believe that during the time before 1816, Hahnemann realized that there was something more and started looking for it. Found some of those clues and indications, and then from 1816 to 1828 was working both on theory and application.
Chronic disease theory.
Chronic disease theory and application, because remember, that was, once he discovered chronic diseases, he says, a new class of diseases, or a class of diseases for which an entirely new set of medicaments was required. And so Hahnemann made a number of transitions at that point. So he shifted from the pellet dose, so the carrier being a dry carrier, to a water dose. He shifted the types of remedies. In the beginning it was mostly the use of plants or substances already with a medicinal, track record.
Yep.
Into mostly mineral remedies. I mean, you look at the remedies, during the time frame of the chronic diseases, it's like 2/3 of them are, 7/8 of them are minerals, 2/3 are carbons.
Which is massively different from materia medica pura, which is mostly plants.
Yeah, mostly plants, right? So he had a massive change. And so along that time then, he's got to go and try this on his patients. You see, so he had to develop the theory.
Practice becomes practice.
Practice becomes practice, exactly. And so I think that's where the change came. Anyway, I want to go back to the horse and buggy for 1 second, because if you think about it, he's now committed to the liquid remedy.
Yep.
But he says we still need the globules, because inadvertent shaking of those medicines will alter the potency.
Of the globules?
No, of the liquid remedy.
Yes, good.
Right?
Good.
So, and that's where I think the horse and buggy, it just became a horse and buggy story, when in reality, he was actually saying, don't shake them up too much, it's going to change the potency. So, in transit, this would happen, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's a good myth to debunk.
All right. Myth debunked, part 1.
So then we go from the 5th edition of the Organon, which is...
So, you can't just go from 5th edition to the 6th edition, because Hahnemann meets Melanie.
Oh my goodness.
So, dates 1833, 5th edition.
Uh-huh.
A few things happen in the interim years. Hahnemann ends up living with a 35-year-old.
And he's 79 when she arrives.
80. I think he's 80. Oh, actually, that would be... Okay, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
In his 80th year.
In his 80th year. And then off he goes to Paris.
But can we discuss Hahnemann as a cougar?
No, let's leave that for another...
We'll do an entire podcast on Melanie.
He was a complete cougar.
He was a total cougar.
That's a big difference in age.
Yeah. God bless him.
45 years.
45 years.
No, wait. 35 years. 35. See, my math, not so good.
No, if she was 35.
Yeah, plus 35 equals... Oh, it's 45
Hello.
years. Damn.
Clearly this is not a math podcast. Anyway, so Hahnemann then, he moves to Paris. He's working on his distribution of the remedy, or, administration of the remedy, and also working on continuing to evolve his theory. And it was with the 6th and final edition of the Organon that he said he had finally, sorted out a bunch of things. And he says it's with the 6th edition of the Organon that he was finally able to release spirit from its incarceration in matter. Hello.
Sounds like Oppenheimer. So that is the development of the 50 millesimal potencies, right? The LM potencies, or the Q potencies. And then all of the problems of where do I start go away, because he says categorically you start with 1, and then you go to 2, then you go to 3, then you go to 4. There's no guesswork about, this is a 200 case, or this case is a 12C case, or this case is a 10M case. There's no, I'm going to start high, because by the time that he's finishing his, magnum opus, his career, he says categorically, start at the bottom and work your way up.
I mean, there are all sorts of ways that we can interpret this from practical experience. Like, I find that starting with LM1 or Q1, my clients get more aggravations than with 3.
See, it's interesting. I wouldn't quite call it an aggravation, but that's my experience as well. Dr. David Levy, greetings David, taught me that years ago. And he said something kind of pithy. He says, no, start with LM3 as your lowest potency. And of course I said, why? And he says, don't argue. No, he actually said, because it's where you click over into Avogadro's number. So it's interesting, by the numbers, by the zeros, an LM3 is it's a very different remedy, but it's the numerical equivalent of about a 12 to 13C. And I think that was really interesting to hear that for the first time. And so that's what you and I very often do. Now, the reason that we might also start and favour the 50 millesimal potencies is because case management becomes so
much easier. Oh my gosh.
And I think this is sometimes forgotten when I'm hearing people agonise, or students agonise over, do I give a 200 or a 30, and then, all the rest of it, and then how many doses, and they start to turn themselves into a jar of spaghetti.
Well, because, if you think about it, because so much of what we know about homeopathy is related to the vast majority of homeopaths in English-speaking countries who were overly influenced by James Tyler Kent, who only went to the 4th edition of the Organon. Centesimal potency delivery is kind of that has been the way. And I don't think that, people feel as comfortable with, LM or Q potencies. And I having spent so many years researching Hahnemann's journey and his attempts to mitigate aggravations and to deliver remedies in a way that actually renders cure, especially once he made the connection to chronic diseases, it was such a game changer.
Yep.
It doesn't, he still used centesimal potencies. If you look at his case books from Paris, he was still doing that, but he really was spending, more time experimenting with Q potencies. And the other thing about sort of potency or posology is, if we stay with the idea that Hahnemann was very much about minimizing aggravation, how do you bring about cure without overexciting the vital force? If you think about the delivery of a medicine, there are only so many factors in play: number of succussions, the amount of dilution, or the repetition. Mm-hmm. And he gets very clear about the number of succussions. In the final edition of the Chronic Diseases, there's a footnote where he says, by the way, I monkeyed around with the number of succussions, and I herewith take back what I said in previous editions, stick with 10. So if you say, okay, then you're married to 10 succussions, then the only thing you have is frequency and the amount of water. And what we found in our helpline, in our clinic, and in our practices is, working with serial dilutions, working with big dilutions and multiple dilutions. Wow.
I think for me, the extraordinary flexibility that comes with the use of the LMs is that, and the Q potencies, is that you can, Hahnemann's directives around speeding the cure suddenly become very real.
Yeah.
And things genuinely go smoother.
It's amazing.
You absolutely have the capacity to know, well, pretty much. There's a few circumstances where sometimes a reaction is, you're not quite sure if it's a return of an old symptom,
right,
or an aggravation, or in fact a proving symptom sometimes, but that's pretty rare. But it's just doable and gentle. No dramas. And when I think about my early days of practice, like the other day I was teaching this case, which I had a spectacular response with this guy who'd been an insomniac since he was 6 years old. Prescription was Scorpion, and the potency was 10M. And in the follow-up, when he's saying, I'm amazing, look at me, I've never felt like this, thank you so much, I had this weird experience of about 3 weeks where I went numb. And I said, what do you mean? And he went, well, kind of emotionally and physically numb. But I kept taking the remedy, and then it kind of came out of it. And I'm going, what? And I quite clearly said to him, 2 doses, but I'd given him the whole bottle. He took 5 weeks of Scorpion 10M, went through the fire, and the metaphorical fire,
sure,
and it came out the other end. And I kind of, I like teaching that story, because for me that story went, well, let's be clear that a gentler experience would have been a couple of doses, a couple of,
sure,
and wait. but yeah, and he came out the other end, and like I said, homeopathy is sometimes resilient, and thank God for that. But these days, I would not be doing that in my practice. And those days of big touch wood, knocking on the wood there, those days of aggravations are behind me. So there's no doubt about it that it's for the pragmatic experience of the client that the 50 millesimal potencies seem to be appropriate. And like Hahnemann says, and this is not just in some cases, it's in all cases. Yeah. That's the dog, the cat,
well,
the
of
infant.
Chronic.
No, but it's interesting. But he, in the Organon, 6th edition, it's for all. He's writing it for acute and chronic in animals and adults, and all the rest of it. So I find that kind of interesting. Now, of course, when we've got students that have done some homeopathy along the way, they say, but my teacher, says always start with 200, or, like Shilton, I remember him saying, oh, I just give 200. It's the potency, it's the remedy, not the potency, which is the key thing. I know that there's elaborate, some homeopaths have come up with somewhat elaborate schematics and models.
Yep.
Of when it's I don't even want to say that, they've never made any sense to me. The one thing which has made sense to me, which I must admit I still get frustrated about, that it doesn't seem to translate as easily for new students, is that if you are going to use a centesimal potency, 4th or 5th edition, then really the way in which you choose that potency to begin your treatment plan is to match the perceived vitality of the client to the perceived vitality of the...
Do you think, though, that it's just hard? We don't speak in the language of vitality in a clear enough way that if you're new to homeopathy, the adaptive process you have to do in your mind is, I think it's kind of tough to do. There's so many factors there, and it's, why
don't students just not understand when I say just do what I want? Do what I say.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that. They ask all sorts of sticky questions.
I know. That's when you get smart people.
Man, smart. Are you finding that they're getting smarter?
Totally.
Does it worry you?
No. It makes me excited.
No, it worries. When I said worry, I just meant that it means you've got to be on your game.
Oh, yeah, that's for sure. But with the demand for, well-trained and, sort of high-achieving homeopaths, there is so much demand for it. It's like, it's amazing to think in the decades that we've been in practice how much higher the demand is for services now and how much more complicated the cases are, Anyway, I think this was a really nice start to this conversation of potency and posology. And, there's a lot more. There's a lot more to talk about.
Yeah.
I think we should do that in another podcast.
Damn. All right.
Can't
Potency.
pass.
I got one question for you.
Okay.
I knew that there was something that was outstanding. Why do you think Kent ignored the 5th edition of the Organon?
Why do I think Kent ignored?
And for context, folks, Kent, born 1849, starting to get a groove up in his 30s, so that's in the late 70s, early 80s, or 1880s. When he started writing and practicing, and his casebooks clearly demonstrate that he was using the 4th edition of the Organon, and we can excuse him completely for not knowing about the 6th edition,
because
no one knew about it.
Published at that point.
But the 5th edition had been published in 1833, and so Kent ignored it. He just ignored Hahnemann's, later book.
Do you want my cynical answer or another answer?
I want your controversial, cynical answer.
So on one hand, I would say that...
Lay it out.
Well, I've thought about this from a number of perspectives. And if I just think about it as sort of the human experience and Kent's experience, Kent came into homeopathy as an eclectic physician. So he already had a set of tools. He finds homeopathy, right? After, was it his second wife was cured by homeopathy? Clara. And then he becomes a homeopath, but he wasn't as... he didn't stick to the narrative as closely as perhaps...
Nope.
Right? And I think his Swedenborgian background, his eclectic medical background come together and kept him, I think, from exploring that. Like he sort of had it down, and he came up with a system that worked for him. So if we look at it through the lens of what he applied through the Swedenborgian influence, there was this emphasis on the spiritual and the mental and emotional healing, and he was the first to connect the higher potencies to the mental and emotional state. And I just think that he had a concept and was running with it. You know, I guess it's not so cynical. I think it's just to me, it just feels sort of logical.
Right.
I don't know.
But it's interesting because, you know, it is that sort of Swedenborgian influence, and Swedenborg was saying that you are sick physically long before you. You're sick energetically long before you are physically, and in fact, the disconnect which has created the illness is infinitesimal. It is
exactly,
you know, yeah,
and it's at the level of the will. You know,
got it.
So there's so much of that. I mean, and that's sort of the.
It doesn't explain why he didn't give higher potencies in liquid. Anyway,
that's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have an answer.
No, I like your cynical answer. That wasn't cynical.
It wasn't very cynical, actually, which is good.
Yeah, you're right.
Anyway,
you're okay.
So there's so much more to talk about, but let's do it on another podcast.
All right, that's it.
Yeah.
All right. See you, folks.
Bye.